As the world turned into the 20th century and the old nations of Europe marched to war, in Queensland, Australia, a baby was born to parents from opposite ends of the world. Instead of celebrating, the parents of this baby had just broken the law.
The law at that time was hiding the fact that white man was having an affair with black women. That's the way I think about it.
The year was 1914. Then, it was illegal to have sex with or wed an Aboriginal person. Without government consent, an Aboriginal person was at risk of arrest and indefinite confinement to a reserve or mission. The father of the baby, Leandro Illin, never accepted the racist view of the day. A Russian nobleman, he lived by the ideals of justice and equality.
He thought it was very unfair to send my mother when she never done nothing. It was only a natural thing. If a man and a woman have an affair, they have a child. That baby was my brother. I'm a daughter of Leandro Illin and Kitty Clarke, she was.
Once the child was born, Leandro sought official permission to marry Kitty.
To the Chief Protector of Aboriginals. Sir, it is a difficult thing to write to you, but a man must do it when it is necessary. I desire to obtain a permit to marry an Aboriginal woman whose name is Kitty Clarke. She is a kind sort of woman and belongs to one of those tribes with hundreds at one time, at the present time being reduced to a handful. My selection is right in her country.
But Leandro's honesty would prove to be Kitty's downfall. Kitty and Leandro met on her country. Her first husband Kitty and Leandro met on her country. Her first husband had been sent to Brisbane by his boss, never to return. And Kitty was left with small children, Emma, Molly, and baby Ginger. To survive, Kitty went to work for the Illin family. Leandro Illin was 32 and had travelled the world, but was still a lonely bachelor.
Ladies do not like pioneering or pioneers, but prefer the town man always, whose life is never so interesting and valuable for the country as that of the pioneer. The woman of Australia should be more patriotic. In the old country, the woman do not wait until the man has plenty of money, but marry and make a home together. It is difficult to make a home without a wife.
Their affair may not have been meant for marriage in the first place, like a lot of white men that came to Australia. But when he found out there was a baby, for marriage in the first place, like a lot of white men that came to Australia. But when he found out there was a baby that was his going to come to life, well, he wasn't going to run away from his own flesh and blood like a lot of others did and leave him behind to be punished and suffered by the law and everything else, the way they were treated.
Leandro Illin's values were steeped in the Russian ideology of Narodnik, where the privileged classes would return land and honour to peasant people. The Russian Narods wanted justice and called for a revolution. Leandro's family were persecuted for their principles and had to flee Russia, migrating to South America and then on to Australia. When the Illins arrived, Leandro was 28 years old. It was September, the year 1910. Their ship, the Umra, docked in Brisbane at the first flush of spring. Leandro's father, the old patriarch Nikolai Illin, was in search of a working man's paradise. He persuaded 12 other Russian families to take up neighbouring selections in tropical Queensland on the Atherton Tableland. The community became known as Little Siberia.
Mum helped Pop to clear the countries and quite a bit of brushing and chopping, helping Pop.
But the same patch of land was already supporting a community. The Nudgeon tribe, Kitty Clarke's people. Her country was the Russell River, which runs around the highest mountain in Queensland, Bartle Frere. Her people had lived for thousands of years in the isolation of the rich, dark rainforest. Their first meeting with white people was only 25 years before the Illin family arrived. Flora's grandmother Emily passed down her memory of the event.
The story she told me, they were curious, you know, looking at these white people, men, and they chased them and caught my grandmother and took her back to where they were, and when they would give her something to eat, she was frightened to eat it. She reckoned she'd go and push it under a big log somewhere.
5 years after this first encounter, Flora's mother, Kitty Clarke, was born. Kitty's generation was the first to be born with white neighbours, whose very survival depended on farming land covered in dense forest. Each selector was obliged to clear 30 acres of virgin forest every year. Trees were cut down and dried out, until finally in December it was all set alight, burning for days, sometimes weeks. What had been lush forest was left black and bare, ready for pasture. They called the place Malanda.
My grandfather had a big patch of scrub in the top of Malanda, and there was about 200 of them camped on my father's. They lived off the rainforest and walnuts, that was their food, and we came in and chopped it all down and burned it, and they were all displaced. They had no food left.
They lost all their hunting ground. So what do? Try to get into the white people's way. But knowing nothing, they were exploited. They'd work them for nothing. Might give them a shirt and a trousers so that they wouldn't be walking in front of everybody naked. Otherwise, they probably wouldn't have gave them a shirt and a trouser to put on.
Leandro Illin had a different approach to the Indigenous people.
he'd see the Aboriginal tribes people over in the scrub, and then one day he's seen this woman come out and she had little children with her. Then after making friends with her, he used to take food over to her for the children, and then they became good friends, and then he took her to work for the family. And then after that, I think that's when they fell in love and they wanted to get married, so that's when the struggle began.
And soon as my father applied to marry my mother, that's when they started searching for her to send her to the mission. Why? Because there was a half-caste child that was a son to a white man. She had 3 other Aboriginal kids. They didn't send them to the mission. The moment she had a half-caste child, the police came straight away looking for her to send her away to the mission.
The police were obliged to arrest Kitty under the terms of the Aboriginal Protection Act of 1897. The Act empowered police, protectors and reserve superintendents to control every aspect of an Indigenous Australian's life. Where they lived, worked, how much they were paid, what they spent their money on, who they married, and how they raised their children. There was nothing that went unobserved.
The norms in society didn't look upon the relationship between a black woman and a white man as being something that was acceptable. It was totally unacceptable. So there must have been a lot of love there, that's all I can say.
Affairs that crossed the colour bar were not only criminal offences, they were viewed as immoral. Back then, men of science believed the Aborigines of Australia were a dying race. If left alone, the inevitable would take its course. But Aboriginal people weren't left alone. Men living on the frontier sought sexual relief, with or without consent. What they desired was known as black velvet. Revered author Henry Lawson was one of the first to popularise the phrase black velvet. It described the soft, smooth skin of Aboriginal women, or gins as they were referred to then. The men who associated with Aboriginal women were known as gin jockeys, and their children were often referred to as burnt corks. As a result, a new race was born. White Australia called them the half-caste.
Well, they were the sufferers. How many half-caste kids was left behind through white man and black woman's relationship?
Viewed with deep suspicion, the half-caste was an aberration. And so too the man who created the anomaly. Australian author Ernestine Hill wrote, "He has burnt his bridges. He never comes back." Leandro did just that. When he chose to marry the mother of his child, he turned his back on polite society.
Well, I think he had a big struggle. Couldn't have been an easy life for him. Oh, I suppose he was happy in other ways. He had us kids and Mum with him, but outside of that, he must have had a hard life.
Policing the affairs of Indigenous Queenslanders was the protector of Aborigines, John Blakely. This man had complete control of every Aboriginal Australian's life in Queensland. John Blakely would go on to dominate the lives of Kitty, Leandro and their children for decades to come. A committed Anglican, Blakely believed the Aboriginals were like children. and the best approach to management was segregation to reserves and missions.
Not only do they protect the child races from the unscrupulous white, but they help preserve the purity of the white race from the grave social dangers that always threaten when there is a degraded race living in loose conditions at the back door.
And every day they took away 4 of our local Aboriginals. All the tribe would be round, trying to save them from going, crying and weeping and wailing. It's just like a funeral some days. It was very upsetting. And my mother was very upset. Nobody's doing anything to help them,
Blakely envisaged practically the whole of the native population and that of neighbouring districts would be contained at his mission.
Here in Queensland, they took mother and the kids to the mission. I don't know what they wanted to do with them, why. But they took them away anyway.
While thousands of Aboriginal people were rounded up for reserves and missions, Leandro and Kitty persevered with their application to marry. On behalf of the Protector, local policeman Constable Pike interviewed all connected with their application. His final recommendation was rare in those times. It was in their favour.
If permission is refused, Illin will be in trouble over the children, and he threatens to shoot himself and the gin too, so I don't see what should prevent him from marrying her if he wants to. Kitty Clarke is a sensible stamp of Aboriginal, and his Russian neighbours state she's good enough for him. I don't see the good got by sending the Aboriginal to Hull River Mission.
Blakely fired back to the policeman his own views on the marriage.
I am very much adverse to the marriage of full-blood Aboriginal women to white men, and especially whereas in this case the woman has 3 Aboriginal pickaninnies. Return Illin his documents, and please advise him I cannot grant his request.
6 weeks later, a removal order was issued.
I do hereby order that the 4 Aboriginals hereinafter named be removed. Kitty Clarke for her own benefit, her 3 children to accompany their mother.
He didn't think much of anybody's feelings or never had any consideration for a child or a man that was willing to do the right thing. So what sort of a man would he be? I wouldn't think much of him.
Kitty was 5 months pregnant with Leandro's 2nd child. It was May, and winter was just beginning to set in. For his part in the affair, Leandro was also at risk of arrest. Cohabitation or even sleeping under the same blanket was a criminal offence. Leandro had to inform police exactly where intercourse took place. He referred to sex as connection.
I will not say I have kept Kitty Clarke on my place. When I had connection with Kitty Clarke, I was in scrub, and it was not at my place.
Where Kitty and Leandro connected was central to the police investigation.
They used to come looking for her.
If Kitty was caught on Leandro's property, it would be proof enough to make an arrest. Kitty hid with the 4 children in the bush, while Leandro continued working his farm.
They're not touching him, but they're chasing my mother.
Reaching a dead end with his application to marry Kitty, Leandro abandoned his farm and joined Kitty in the scrub. The children were handed over to their grandparents.
My father said to his father, "Don't let them take him if they come here. Don't let them know he's here. Don't let them take him." My grandfather said, "Over my dead body." He just fought on, took my mother into the scrub and lived amongst the other Aboriginals. He was like a bushranger. They had trackers. And they were good too, those trackers, those days. Because, you see, when my father would be walking, he'd have boots. And the rest of the tribe wouldn't have shoes. He'd be easily tracked down, wouldn't he? So my father said to the tribe, you tell the tracker not to track me down because he'd be the first one I'll shoot. He said he wasn't going to let him take his son.
He was a man of the bush sort of thing, you know, and then the love life come along later on. Yeah, and them old bush fellas, I think they were like that. Yeah, that's the way they were. They weren't the romantics.
He must have had so much love for her, you know, to climb mountains and rivers, and I think there was a big river there. He would have swam the river for her. Yeah. To stand his ground for what he wanted and what he thought was his rights. He had to do it, and he done it.
In his determination to marry Kitty, Leandro ignored Blakely's refusal and moved his request up the chain of command. Visiting Atherton to inspect the railway was a senior Labor Party politician who would later become Premier, William Gillies.
And he fronted this Premier. He said, why have you got a law here that if a white man wants to marry a black woman, you don't allow it? He said, I've got a child to an Aboriginal woman. He said, and I'm willing to marry her and look after my son. He said, what's wrong with that? So Premier Gillies could see that my father was genuine, and so he said, I'll see what I can do when I get back to Brisbane. So when he got back, he sent permission for my father to marry my mother.
On the 7th of September 1915, Constable Pike handed Leandro his permit to marry Kitty. They would have to leave the district and go to a courthouse, but news of their permit hadn't reached the neighbouring police. Leandro didn't trust the officers to respect their permit.
He wouldn't go into Atherton. The police would have grabbed her straight away. He wasn't married to her yet, and my father wouldn't have been able to stop them. So he worked his head.
And decided to walk 60 kilometres through the bush, hiding from the police.
He went down the range through the scrub into Innisfail, because they weren't searching for him there.
Kitty was heavily pregnant, only 4 weeks away from giving birth to Flora.
Well, coming down by the road now, it's far enough, but you imagine walking. And at that time, they had to find their way because that wasn't open, there was scrub, and it was hard. Probably it was horrible because it would be raining. And they walked into the courthouse there and married my mother in the courthouse in Innisfail. And he never got the permission from Blakely. He got the permission from the Queensland Premier, Gillies. He signed his name and she put a cross.
Remarriage of Kitty Clarke, Abo, to Leandro Albin. A Greek or Southern Europe alien came today, accompanied by a female Aboriginal woman named Kitty.
They were shabby and he had whiskers because they had to walk all the way down the range. That's why they must have said an alien walked in and married an Aboriginal woman. And then they went back And then they went all over the tableland and couldn't touch her then. They got married in September and I was born in October. If he didn't worry about my mother and his son, I would have wound up in the mission too. Biranya. That's my Aboriginal name for my mother.
2 years later, another baby is born, Tommy. His mother Kitty named him Puchiti, meaning little lizard with round head. Dick, Flora and Tommy were the first wave of half-castes that would bedevil the authorities.
It is difficult to see how this social blot can be erased. Only complete segregation of the black race, which is financially impractical, or sterilisation of the females, an absolutely unacceptable solution, will prevent the results of intercourse.
Fathering a half-caste family pushed Leandro to the edge of society, but being Russian labelled him a potential enemy of the state. In 1917, Russian troops were seen as deserters by their Australian allies. Russians were called back to their motherland to fight Bolsheviks who had seized power. The next year, they assassinated the Tsar and his family. Leandro and his father were committed to a socialist revolution in Russia, but strongly opposed Bolshevik tactics. Together, they denounced Bolshevism in the Cairns Post newspaper.
A mob of criminals and ignorant wrongdoers is ruling Russia at the present time. Let the dirty spot of the murders remain on them alone.
In response to the statement, the Russian Association in Brisbane ostracised the Illin family for their stance against Bolshevism. The same year, 1918, a powerful cyclone struck far north Queensland. "47 people perished. Leandro and Kitty's home was destroyed.
Those days it would be raining 9 months in a year. More rain all the time. My father had to leave there because it was too much rain. He ended up getting sick.
Leandro decided to sell what was left and head west, where the country is hard and dry.
He was leaving his father and mother behind, and his brother, which separated him from his family. And it was hard for my mother too, I suppose. She was getting away from her mob too.
Kitty left behind 2 children from her previous marriage. Her eldest daughter Emma was betrothed to a Nudgeon man, and her second daughter Molly had been killed by a falling branch. Kitty would never be the same after leaving her land. Country gave her a complete structure of law, language, kin and culture to live by. Without it, she would be lost.
Anyway, she followed him away from the tribe. All her people, her mother, we all went down there, into Mount Garnet, into Gunnawara, and down to Christmas Creek.
For the next 3 years, Leandro mustered cattle away from his family for long periods of time, leaving Kitty the sole guardian of their 4 children. A distressing situation for a woman raised in the security of her tribal band, where solitude would have been rare.
Well, it would have been very hard. I can remember my grandmother, her totem bird was a black cockatoo. And when we were around Greenbow, my mother would hear a black cockatoo singing out. And she used to be crying.
Kitty committed herself completely to the family. Her next child, Harry, she assigned the black cockatoo. The cockatoo carried the meaning of her mother and her people. Comfort in foreign lands. A tool for survival in a country full of fear. To Kitty, even their house was a target for intruders.
Scared. If my father wasn't coming home that night, or he might have gone away, might be for about a week or something, she would never stay in the house. She'd go way out in the bush and stop and take all us kids with her. She'd never sleep in the house. Come home in the morning, she'd be so tired, she'd go to sleep. All us kids would be wandering around. And then soon as it'd be getting dark, dusk, she'd lock the house and take off again.
World War I may have passed, but revolution was still churning through Russia and reverberating in Australia. Red flag rallies were held in the city streets as unionists took up the socialist cause. Australian soldiers just back from the Great War considered Russians to be traitors. On the evening of the 24th of March 1919, 7,000 people fought a pitched battle in the streets of Brisbane. Russians were attacked in a violent confrontation with Australian loyalists and returned servicemen. They chanted, "Hang them, burn their meeting place down. Clear out of Queensland all the dirty Russians." Leandro's parents, brother and sister, still living on their selections in the Atherton tablelands, had all denounced Bolshevism and were now caught in the middle. They were ostracised by their Bolshevik-leaning countrymen and shunned by white Australia. They were looking for a way out. South America was their dream. Leandro had every intention of joining them, but his wife and children had no rights to travel. They were tied to the state. Leandro pleaded for passports on their behalf.
As my children are growing, I can see them being despised and looked down on by many people. In South America, the people there are of color all, so the dark blood in my children would be no objection.
Leandro's Aboriginal wife Kitty and their children were all under state surveillance. But Kitty's first son, Ginger, from her previous relationship, was the only one under the Aboriginal Protection Act. Kitty escaped the mantle when she married Leandro, so too their children. Ginger came under the Act because he was the only child classified full blood. The Chief Protector of Aboriginals, John Blakely, was again opposing Leandro's request.
This man, Illin, is an erratic character and has for many years lived amongst and made use of the blacks for his own purposes. I cannot regard this present request with anything but suspicion. In another and less civilised country, this full-blood child will be valuable to Illin as labour, and doubtless nothing better than a slave.
So he must have had it in for my father, because my father beat him in the end and married my mother without his permission.
And even though he may be legally entitled to take his wife and his own children out of the country, if she and the half-caste children are allowed to go, I consider the full-blood should be sent to a reserve.
We could all go, she could go, but not him.
What am I to do? I love my children, and I am worrying over their future. I do not want to see them grow up and be bullied by some policeman under the protection.
Well, when he couldn't take Ginger, he wasn't going to separate my mother from him. So he didn't bother.
Leandro's campaign was over. January 1921, his parents and siblings sailed away to South America.
It would have been very easy for him to leave her at different times, not take care of the children. So it was probably more than honour and duty that kept them together, and I believe it was love.
What he did was really outstanding. Very few men would do that. Very few.
Yeah, they were all right. They were good mates. Wherever he went, they both went.
Flora's father Leandro took a job with the Atkinson family, Queensland cattle barons who owned massive tracts of land along the Herbert and Burdekin rivers. For the next few years, Leandro, Kitty and the kids ranged across the 13,000 square kilometre property, living in bush camps and outstations, while Leandro worked cattle and baled water.
When we're in the bush, we're in tents. My father never had much. He'd just get a couple of blankets and make our bed on the floor, get some grass and lay it on the ground floor and put a canvas over it. All of us kids used to get in there and cover up with the one blanket and keep warm.
The family continued to grow. Vera Araluan was born. Nicknamed Luli, she was Leandro and Kitty's fifth child. By 1925, Leandro was working for young Dale Atkinson, a short-tempered man when it came to children, and Kitty and Leandro had 6 to contend with.
Harry got the handsaw and cut a leg of his table. And he said, "Who cut my table?" Tommy said, "Harry." He said, "You tell Harry I'll cut his hands off." Harry heard it. He was that frightened that he's going to get his hands cut off.
The 6-year-old boy took off along the riverbank. Harry had a knack for getting himself into trouble. Luli passed down this story to her daughter.
Uncle Harry went through a barbed wire fence and he got caught up and he tore his testicles and stuff, and she said Granddad just picked him up, took him back to the place and just pulled out the sewing needle and the cotton, just pushed it all back in and just stitched him up. Nobody was around or anything. She said you had to do something, and that's what he did.
At the time Harry ran away, Kitty was 5 months pregnant. Unable to look for him herself, she sent Ginger out to track his little brother. On dusk, Harry was found, 4 miles away. With 6 children ranging in age from 14 to 3, Kitty's pregnancy was far from relaxed. Flora remembers the outstation at Christmas Creek where they lived had a strange, foreboding atmosphere.
I didn't like Christmas Creek. Maybe because I had some sort of premonition there was something going to happen here. I used to cry a lot here while I'd be riding around and mustering the cows in. I'd be crying. For what reason, I don't know.
On the 14th of May 1925, Kitty went into labour.
Oh, my mother was very frightened. She was frightened.
Her contractions began late in the afternoon. She was 2 weeks overdue. Away from her mother, sister and aunts, she had to manage the birthing herself. She made a grass bed and refused to be moved off it. The children were sent away from the house to a tent out of earshot of their mother's cries. Kitty laboured for more than 2 days before Leandro sent a message to Mrs. Corr, who lived 10 kilometres down the road.
I remained with Mr. and Mrs. Illin all that night. I could see a doctor was required before Mrs. Illin could give birth.
And I can remember this too. While they were talking, we had a big dog, he's in the photo. He started to howl. Oh, he was crying, howling. And when he started to howl, I can remember Mrs. Corr. She said, "Oh." I can remember that well, because the dog was howling. She was frightened, see?
At dawn the next day, Mrs. Corr sent for an ambulance. The emergency call would take 5 hours just to get through. A horseman had to ride 65 kilometres to reach the post office and tap out a telegram. Help was a further 150 kilometres away at Charters Towers. But being a Sunday, the message travelled all over northern Queensland before it reached its destination. With only the help of Mrs. Corr, later that evening, a baby boy was delivered.
Yeah, I think they said it was nearly 15 pounds. So how exhausted she must have been. Mrs. Corr had the baby in a dish and was trying to revive it in the water. My father called me in and they showed me the baby. I seen my mother. I kissed her goodnight and never seen her anymore.
Three days after her pain began, the ambulance arrived. Kitty was barely alive.
They were hard old days.
The baby boy was stillborn.
Yes, she knew. My poor mother.
She says she can remember her and Uncle Harry peeping through the crack in the wall, and she said they seen the baby. It was a big baby, and she said, and then all they knew that their mama had died.
I remember saying to Dad once what happened to his mum, and he said that she died in childbirth. When she did pass away, he remembers them wrapping her in the sugar bag and burying her.
Leandro did what he could to protect his children from the tragic news. He told them she was taken away to hospital.
I had it in mind all the time that she was there, buried, on the bank of the creek near the fence, and there was a new grave. I could see where they dug up the ground. I thought, that's Mum there. But I told him that she was dead, so we'd be sitting down and having a cry, because we knew Mum was never coming out. And then about a month after, my father called us all one night and he said, Mum is not going to come back. He said, your mother is dead.
Kitty's people, the Nudgeon, believe her birthplace of Bartle Frere is where the spirits return after death. Kitty Clarke Illin was dead at 35, leaving behind 6 children for Leandro to raise alone.
I sort of grew up fast. I had to carry a little bit of responsibility for my younger sister and 2 brothers. I wasn't a child much after my mother died.
Alone in the bush, they had to create a home for themselves. A little respite on a scorching day was a tin toy. It went everywhere with them.
That was their toys. They used to play that, and then they'd be building roads and on the ground, and they'd camp here this night, and they'd be camping over there in the travelling, see? But they're pulling this thing.
But it was far from utopia. Leandro was a lone father with 6 dependent children, all with brown complexions. It was so-called little brown half-castes that the authorities were keen to round up. John Blakely, Chief Protector of Aborigines, believed
they must learn to think white as well as talk white.
While a vigorous campaign was underway removing children to reserves and missions, Leandro could no longer afford to leave his children alone for weeks at a time. So in 1927, he took a job at Greenvale on the Atkinson homestead as their gardener, and life got much better.
When we come into Greenvale, well, we're right near the Burdekin then. We lived in the water then. We used to swim a lot. Go fishing, plenty of fish. We'd stop there all day, diving and swimming, and forget about even eating. When Dad used to go away, sometimes he'd tell us, "I'll put the meat on here, see that the meat is cooked, pull it off." We'd forget about that. We'd be swimming all day. He'd come home and the meat either wasn't cooked or it'd be overcooked.
Leandro was working for £2 a week, but the Aboriginal workforce were paid much less. 7 years earlier, in 1919, an agreement was brokered between government and pastoralists that legislated different rates of pay according to race. It was known as the Slow Worker Clause, a law that would carry for another 50 years before it was abolished. Aboriginal people were expected to sign on to stations as soon as they were old enough to work. On behalf of the government, the station owner became their legal guardian, and Aboriginal workers lost their freedom to move away from the station. It was time for 15-year-old Ginger to do the same. But it was a prospect Leandro could not abide.
Having reared the boy, I am deeply attached to him, and he is very affectionate to his brothers and sisters. Children of his age are generally whipped on stock runs. I want to protect him, as his mother's wish always was, from being ill-treated. Still, my main reason to make this application is that I simply can't part from him on account of the other kiddies, whom he loves tenderly.
Ginger was given temporary leave. Leandro kept his family together. The Illins did well on the Atkinson station and were well liked. Station records show Leandro was shouted 30 shillings to take his family to the Ingham show. On the way home, their truck broke down on the Mount Fox Road. Heading in the same direction was Dick Houlihan, a young Aboriginal stockman.
He was down here droving cattle, and they were going back. And we were camped there waiting for somebody to pick us up, so we rode back to Greenvale on the horse.
Flora was 13, Dick was 21, keen on Flora, and ready to marry.
Good-looking young fella, but I wasn't taking any notice at that time. He was still just another young fella around the station.
Dick Houlihan would have been hard to miss. He had a way with wild animals and was an expert horsebreaker. But like Ginger, he was under the Protection Act and treated as a slow worker. Dick Houlihan approached his prospective father-in-law with a proposition.
He came to me and said, "Old man, I want Flora." I said, "It's no news to me. Does she want you?" "She's all right. And look here, she doubts me. I will swim the Hinchinbrook Channel and get there or die in the attempt."
Leandro consented to the marriage, but first laid down a challenge of his own.
My father wouldn't let me marry until he got out of the act. He said, while he's under the act and I marry him, I'll be under the act too. He would never allow that. Although he had a lot of respect for Dick, and he wanted me to marry him, but they were under the act and he didn't want that.
So unlikely was the prospect of an exemption from the Act, wedding bells for Flora seemed impossible. In the early years of the 20th century, a tide of socialism threatened the royal houses of Europe. The Illin family from landed Russian nobility turned against their class and joined the rebel intellectuals. They fled Tsarist Russia looking for a better world, believing Australia was a working man's paradise. The Illins claimed a selection on the Atherton tableland in the rainforests of northern Queensland. But their home was already home to the Nudgin people, who had lived in the same rainforest for thousands of years. When Leandro Illin wanted to marry a Nudgin woman, Kitty Clarke, he met the full force of the White Australia policy and the Aboriginal Protection Act. Then, it was illegal to intermarry.
The law at that time was hiding the fact that white man was having an affair with black women. That's the way I think about it.
Leandro persisted, and in 1915 was one of the first permitted to marry an Aboriginal woman in Queensland. He and Kitty raised 6 children, but their relationship was such a taboo, the family lived on the fringes of the frontier, where Kitty died in childbirth. When the world plunged into the Great Depression, Leandro Illin moved his young family to the Sugar Coast near Ingham, North Queensland, on a little property called Utopia, and survived by supplying timber to the sugar mills with the help of his 4 sons. Flora took care of the youngest children, Harry and Luli.
I had no mother. I had to carry a little bit of what I knew. I wasn't a child much after my mother died. I had to be kind of grown up.
The bush was a tough place for a girl to be a mother. But it was at Utopia Flora faced her own battle to marry. At Utopia, the girl would become a woman. Flora was just 14 when she agreed to marry a 21-year-old stockman, Dick Houlihan. The only obstacle? Her fiancé was under the Aboriginal Protection Act, legislation that made every Aboriginal Australian a ward of the state. Under the Act, they were treated as slaves. Work was compulsory and wages were withheld. Flora's father, Leandro, insisted she could only marry a free man.
He said, while he's under the Act and I marry him, I'll be under the Act too. Although he had a lot of respect for Dick and he wanted me to marry him. They were under the Act and he didn't want that.
Dick Houlihan was the son of an Irish father and a Gugubardan Aboriginal mother who was indentured to a cattle station. His parents weren't married, so his father Michael Houlihan had no legal guardianship of his own son. Dick was consigned to the station as a state ward and had to work for food and shelter.
My father started work when he was 10. He was employed as a houseboy. He wasn't allowed to leave the station, even though his father was white. They wouldn't let him go. I've got letters now from the department where Michael Houlihan wanted to take him away and send him to school. And the department heads wrote back that it would serve no good purpose for him being educated. Now that he is 10, he's just becoming useful to the station. That's what the letter said. And then when his mother wanted to take him, they wouldn't let him go either.
Dick's mother, Lucy, also under the Protection Act, had no control of her own life or any rights over her son. The attitude of the day can be summed up by a child removal officer from Western Australia.
I would not hesitate to separate any half-caste from its Aboriginal mother. No matter how frantic momentary grief might be at the time, they soon forget their offspring. The removal of the child is felt no more deeply than a bitch the loss of a pup.
Lucy took to the bush, escaping the station. She returned to her traditional country but left without her son. The next time she saw him was 28 years later, when the boy had become a man.
And because he was considered the same as a cow or a sheep or whatever, the property owner just said no, he can't leave here, so he was the property owner's property. That was the law.
I think the law stinks. It was rotten. It was slavery in those times, slavery. There's nothing else, I don't think you can describe it any other way.
After more than 10 years of enforced labour, Dick had accumulated enough to buy a house and car, £200. But at 21, when he wanted to marry Flora, he had no access to his savings. Like all Aboriginals under the Act, the wage Dick earned was locked away in a trust fund held by Queensland's Chief Protector of Aboriginals, John Blakely.
The policy is not to pauperise or spoon-feed the Aboriginal, but to educate them and raise them to higher planes on the social scale.
Workers sporadically got pocket money, doled out by the local policeman.
And if Aboriginals had a bank balance, then they had to go to the policeman and put a thumbprint on a withdrawal slip before they could get money out of the bank. And of course the actual fact of the matter was that all over North Queensland, policemen were putting thumbprints on withdrawal slips and knocking off the funds of Aboriginals, and we just had one case after another.
Them days there's nobody you could complain to. If you went and complained to the police, you'd complain to the people that did it.
Nobody rose up in protest about it. There were very few who stuck their neck out for Aboriginals at the time. But grandfather was one of those. They used to go and get him to come along with them to the police station to make sure that what they were signing for is what they were getting. And the old police sergeant, he hated him.
He wasn't frightened of them. He wasn't frightened of anybody, my father. He didn't care who they were.
By the time of the Depression, the Queensland government had collected hundreds of thousands of pounds of Aboriginal people's earnings. The only chance of freedom was an exemption from the Protection Act, a feat almost impossible to achieve.
Dad employed a solicitor. He had to get statements from different people around to say that he was not a bad bloke. He didn't drink or booze or anything like that.
Dick Houlihan had twice applied for exemption. Both times he was refused. At his third attempt, Dick went to another district where he was unknown. This time, his application was successful. He was free. But the exemption came with strings attached. John Blakely insisted Dick Houlihan's accumulated wages should continue to be held in trust.
Although the man seems fairly intelligent and probably in other circumstances would be deemed capable of managing his own affairs, we cannot recommend this freedom be given him at present. He has a large sum of money to his credit, and as the Russian, Leandro Illin, is very anxious for Houlihan to marry his daughter, it's felt his persistency in applying for the latter's exemption is not wholly disinterested.
Why didn't he release Dick's money? He said that my father would rob him. So he must have had it still in for my father, because my father beat him and married my mother.
Blakely frowned upon white men fraternising with Aboriginal women. 15 years earlier, he accused Leandro of profiteering from his association with Aboriginal people, suggesting he would use his own children as slaves given half the chance.
They were always trying to make that insinuation that he was there for his own purpose. And Grandad was only fighting for what was rightfully Dad's own money.
Blakely's grudge against Leandro was effective. Dick had nothing to offer Flora for their wedding. He asked the local policeman for £1 to cover costs. Surprisingly, Sergeant McHugh said,
"Oh, give him a $5. Man wants more than £1 when he gets married."
On the 16th of May 1932, Flora, at the tender age of 16, married Dick Houlihan.
After we got married, we went to the Royal Hotel. My father and a solicitor that got my husband's exemption. I had a lemonade, and my husband never drank. I think he had a lemonade, and this solicitor, Clements was his name, he might have had a beer. I remember one word he said. When you get the 12th child, he said, name it after me. I can remember that well enough. I said, oh, yeah?
A year later, Ernie was born. By this time, Dick was a free man and able to negotiate his own wages. But his past earnings were still withheld at Blakely's discretion. Dick's father-in-law, Leandro, now a grandfather for the first time, went over Blakely's head and confronted his boss, Home Secretary Hanlon, to release Dick's money.
Father said, why would I want to rob him? That means I'm robbing my daughter and my grandchild. He said, what would I want to do that for? It wasn't long after, got the word that he could go and get his money.
Dick went straight out and bought a house and a flash new car.
Because Dad used to dress fairly well then, but Mum used to iron his white shirt, and then something can go wrong with the car and he'd have to fix it up, and then he'd be all dirty again.
I didn't worry about motor cars much. I worried more about the horses than I did worry about the car.
After all the breakdowns and repairs, the car was sold, and Dick went back to what he did best, stock work, spending most of his time away from his wife Flora and their 3 young children, Ernie, Johnny and Margaret.
We used to go down the river there and swim. That was our bathroom. At night time, I'd bath the kids in the tub, and as for myself, I'd get out in the dark and pour the water over myself and have a bath there. That's how we used to do it.
Far from the bush, in a quiet office in Brisbane, Chief Protector Blakely was given greater powers over Aboriginal people. Legal guardianship of every Aboriginal child in the state under the age of 21. Removals, adoptions and marriages would all be decided by Blakely, not the parents. With 3 children, Flora was alone and vulnerable.
My husband, he was away a lot, so I was left there by myself. And a long way from anything, no telephone. If anyone got bit with a snake or something there, you'd just die before you'd get anywhere. So I thought it was best to move out of that place. And I went into town, into Ingham.
Mum worked at the station hotel.
Mainly I worked there and earned about £4 a week. I was scrubbing floors and washing clothes and ironing clothes.
In consequence of a persistence by Germany in her invasion of Poland, Great Britain has declared war upon her, and that as a result, Australia is also at war.
The year was 1939. Hitler signed a peace pact with Stalin, pacifying Russia, while Nazis invaded neighbouring Poland. Once Russia aligned itself with Germany, Flora's father, Leandro, found himself out of favour.
I am accused of being a communist and a Nazi all in one. I left Russia 47 years ago, and I denounced Bolshevism in the pages of the Cairns Post. My critics think I am preparing this land right for Hitler and Stalin to come and get it. Considering that I have 3 grown-up sons, 2 of whom have been called up for service, am I likely to want anyone to invade Australia? Now that I have spent 31.5 years of my life here and reared a whole Australian family with 2 sons in the army, I think I have a right to be heard.
Leandro was 58 years old. He'd worked physically hard all his life, but war took its toll. His sons Dick, Tom, Harry and Ginger all went into war service.
Original Aboriginal Anzacs. They're not in the army as a curiosity. They are volunteers in the service of the country they love. They come from Australia's oldest family. They've got a fighting tradition thousands of years old.
For their efforts, Aboriginal and Islander servicemen were paid only 1/3 of the white Australians' wage. With his sons away at war, Leandro's timber business suffered.
They had bought a truck on hire purchase, and then Uncle Tommy and Uncle Dick, Uncle Harry, they all ended up in uniform. When the three boys weren't there to drive it, that truck was repossessed.
Leandro was broke, but his old bureaucratic nemesis, John Blakely, was facing problems of his own. His Department of Native Affairs was investigated and condemned for making a profit out of the Aboriginals. Advice to the government was, under normal circumstances, Blakely would be charged with incompetence and inefficiency. Instead, he was judged unfit due to failing mental health and offered dismissal or retirement. He chose retirement.
He probably wasn't mentally sick at all. Just made it easy for him. He wasn't too mentally sick when he could rob everybody.
When it was declared peace and the war was over, the night, everyone was out in the street there in Ingham, in their jammies and, and banging tins and sticks and whatever they could make a noise with.
When the lights go on again, all over the world.
All of Leandro's children survived the war and married.
And the boys are home again, all over the world.
The war changed everything. And as the migrants were coming to Australia, they left behind that colonial attitude. They brought their culture and their ideas, and they came from a war-torn country. They were hurting too and trying to start a new life.
Ingham, where I grew up, was pretty good because there was all sorts of people there, Italians, Chinese, Greeks.
One thing I do remember about my father, John, was that he used to think he was an Italian, I think. He loved spaghetti, ravioli, or anything that was pasta and tomato sauce based. At the start of the week, he'd cook up a big pot of spaghetti. And every breakfast, lunch and dinner for the next week, we would eat spaghetti. And then at the end of the week, he'd cook another pot of spaghetti and it'd go another week. Yeah, spaghetti was important to him, so he loved it religiously.
War's end brought change on many fronts. In 1945, after 13 years of marriage, Flora Houlihan formally separated from her husband Dick.
I was too young anyway. I was only 16. I think I got married too young and didn't know my own mind what I was doing. He wanted me to go back to him different times. He'd get very uppity about it and that. But I never used to take any notice of him. I said, no, I'm not going back. I said, you go your way and I'll go mine.
After the war, weary servicemen returned home to make a new start. One of them was Bert Cook. Meeting Bert changed Flora's life.
I picked up with another fellow. He was a man from northern New South Wales. When he came out of the army, he come up this way to cut cane. And he got to meeting my father. He found out that I was parted from my husband. So we got together.
When the lights go on again.
He was a good man. He was a good man. Well, I was older when I got with him. Oh, Dick was a good man too. But when you're a child, you don't know what you're doing. He said something to Bert one day, and Bert told him. He said, I never broke your home up. Your wife left you a long time ago. I never picked up with Bert for about nearly 2 years after I left him. He said, I can't make Flora go back to you. He said, if she doesn't want to. So it was left to that. They both had sense enough to reason. They were good friends. They had something in common. They believed in communism. And they were very, very friendly. Myself, I reckon communism is a good thing. So us three, we all believed in the same thing. I think we should be all equal. I don't think anybody's any better than anybody else. Rich or poor, if that's what they call communism. I think it's a good thing. That's just my belief. Maybe they'd shoot me for that.
Flora enjoyed political freedom, but her father Leandro had no time for communism.
He said to me, oh, I didn't know I had a communist daughter.
But he wasn't a communist. He was the Russian side of it, a nobility. He had to get out of Russia because of the communist threat. He wasn't what they thought of him, because the way he got around, he wasn't a flash dresser.
A year after the war ended, Leandro, at 64, was gravely ill.
We knew. He knew too. And he used to say to us, I've got to go any time now. He said his heart was no good and there was nothing they could do for him.
He moved to Townsville to be closer to the hospital, living with his son Tom.
Tom was playing the guitar. And my father was there with him and they were singing together. He went away and Dad went to his room, passed away. He thought a lot of us, right to the end. Try to help us. Yeah. He was a good father.
He didn't speak a lot about when his dad passed away. I know where they were staying when it happened, and I see the big old mango tree there, and I thought, oh, if they ever chop that down, that'll be a part of my history gone.
They said, don't be buying him a coffin or anything, just put him like that in the grave. Because we had no money. Those days it was hard. But my brother bought a coffin, put him in a coffin.
Leandro's legacy was not wealth, possession, or property. He left ideas. He married a woman who was a different colour, culture and class, and stood by her and their children to the very end.
He always told us, treat others as you'd like to be treated yourself.
Racial hatred is a poor sentiment. The sooner sectarianism and racial hatred is abolished, the sooner the world will come to universal peace and understanding.
Aussies leave their barracks at Hero, Japan on the way to the battlefront in Korea.
4 years after Leandro Illin's death, the world was at war again. The enemy was not fascism, it was communism.
This is what happens when world communism moves in on a country. This is the kind of mess that it makes of a place where people thought they could live and be happy.
Bombs away! And the blockbusters rain through the protective overcast to wipe out the communist installations below.
The Cold War had set in. In Australia, Prime Minister Menzies tried to outlaw the Communist Party at a referendum. Like many Australians, Flora, Bert and Dick supported the communist cause and rallied on its behalf. The government's bill was defeated. Challenging convention was nothing new for this family. They sent their sons, Ernie and Johnny, to the prestigious Townsville Grammar School for boys. They would be the first Aboriginal students to pass through the gates.
I thought, well, they might be a bit smarter and get a better life than what I had. Dick thought he never had the chance of going to school and education, which he reckoned he'd give to his son.
I was there during the late 40s and early 50s. Well, we played football for a team called Centrals, and when we got in the competition, of course, we'd have a little bit of a jibe and a knuckle up when they tackled you or something. Cop that, Sambo or something, they'd say.
Football and running, he could run. Long distance run. He wouldn't run 2 yards now.
While Ernie and John Houlihan enjoyed a privileged education, the Protection Act was still in force, and thousands of Aboriginal people still suffered under its legislation, including the boys' great-grandmother. Flora's grandmother was Kitty Clarke's mother, Emily, the Nudgeon matriarch who'd experienced first contact with white people. Emily was in her 90s when she was sent to Palm Island Mission near Townsville, Queensland. Living in overcrowded conditions, disease was rampant. Dysentery, malnutrition and parasitic worm infections were common.
The police took her and sent her to Palm Island. With sea all around her, couldn't get out of there. They said she was about 97 and killed her.
They should never have taken her away from the tablelands, because when they took her over there, Mum seems to think that she fretted to be back where she was up there, up in the tablelands. So.
When they went down there, the local Aboriginal couldn't read or write, so I wrote letters for them to Palm Island, to their relations, and when the letter came back from Palm Island, the tribe would all get round and I'd read the letter out, and every time there'd be 2 or 3 dead, you know. It was pitiful. When you put a wild bird in a cage, he dies of fright, you know, he can't cope with it. They sent all these people down to Palm Island, and they were just like wild birds, they just died.
Dick Houlihan took up the fight for his countrymen trapped on Palm Island, seeking assistance from the Communist Party-affiliated Trades and Labour Council.
Appreciate that in this period in history there was not one social organisation in existence that would do anything for Aboriginal rights, with the exception of the trade union movement and the then branch of the Communist Party. And the injustices were boiling up. It was a period in history that was setting the agenda for the 1960s and the referendum in 67, all starting to surface. Well, Dick was part of it. He'd lived it. I was encountering it for the first time. And that's where we first sat down and started to talk about the establishment of an Aboriginals Advancement League, an organisation that allowed the Aboriginal and Islander population to stand 10 foot tall. And it all started to happen from there. And so far as I'm concerned, it was people like Dick Houlihan who made all of that possible.
In 1962, together with Eddie Mabo, Dick Houlihan established the Townsville chapter of the Aboriginal Advancement League. Evelyn Scott was the secretary.
When we started that, people were really nervous, like especially Indigenous people, and they didn't even know us. All communist influenced, and you name it, we were it.
Dick Houlihan and Eddie Mabo, both Indigenous activists and communists, were obvious targets for ASIO, Australia's federal spy agency.
This was Houlihan at the North Queensland District Conference of the Communist Party.
My place was a meeting place. It was nothing to see unmarked cars sitting outside down the road at my place. You pick up the phone and you don't have a line.
This was Houlihan's comrade, Edward Mabo, who was also at the same conference.
Like we were operating sort of under cover. And that's what we did in those days, you know, and Dick was always there.
He believed in everybody being equal, and he always said the old Aboriginal way was really the communist way, because we never owned anything, we never destroyed it, we only took what we wanted, and I believe that.
My granddad, I can remember him and Eddie Mabo used to go on holidays, and they'd go to Canberra every year, lobbying politicians for those basic services.
And there's a lot of foreign correspondence there, he said, and they get publicity about conditions here in Australia.
And he said if anything could embarrass the Australian government, that would, you know, to get them to see how they were treating Aboriginal people.
Dad was looking to a bigger picture. He thought that communism was the problem solver of the world.
In 1965, Australia went into Vietnam. Communism was again the enemy. Flora's nephew, Alec Illin, was conscripted into national service.
Once you're actually in the army, you're neither black or white. You're a person who had the green uniform on, and that green uniform actually gave you the prestige of being alongside a mate. And we all wore that same uniform and lived the same life. It was all right fighting for the country. Prior to 67, you weren't being counted. So I think there was a real difference there. Then the comments were starting to come out. Oh, you're not really Aboriginal, are you? Because you're not really black person. Yeah. And I'll say no. Well, I am really an Aboriginal person. You know, because I'm not a white Australian. I'm an Aboriginal Australian. They were starting to actually put us in an area where we weren't black, we weren't white, we were half caste.
With our family, we're all different coloured. We're all, you know, I'm dark skinned. One of the sisters is fair and green eyes and blonde hair, and even a brother. We used to say to Dad or Mum, are you my mother or are you my father? Because I was dark. Terrible, I know, but, you know, because others are all fairer than you stop and think, well, how come I'm black? I used to get stories like, Mum, how come I'm dark and Sandra's fair? And she'd say, well, you were born at night and Sandra was born during the day, so that was the story I got.
In 1965, Australia went into Vietnam. Communism was again the enemy. Flora's nephew, Alec Illin, was conscripted into national service. Once you're actually in the army, you're neither black or white. You're a person who had the green uniform on, and that green uniform actually gave you the prestige of being alongside a mate. And we all wore that same uniform and lived the same life. Capturing the nation's attention at the time, Charlie Perkins with his freedom rides, and Vincent Lingiari leading the Wave Hill walkout strike.
And I said, well, what was before the Bestie born and I born? That was the blackfellow country.
And the 1967 referendum, spearheaded by Queenslanders like Dick Houlihan and Evelyn Scott.
Vote yes for Aborigines, they want to be Australians too. Vote yes and give them rights and freedoms just like me and you. Vote yes for Aborigines.
We was hoping to just go over the line, see, because people were saying that it wasn't going to be successful. And we talked about the campaign as we listened to the counting, see. Dick said, yes, no problem. And I thought, oh, I hope so. I said, look, even if we just get 51%, that'd be enough to take us over, wouldn't it? He said, oh, more than enough. And then when it came through, and it was 98%, and we screamed and we cried and we yelled the house down, and cups of tea just flowed. We didn't have anything else. We only had cups of tea. Because we didn't have money for a party. But it was just amazing, how people reacted that night. We just couldn't believe it. It was history. History made. We just thought, well, there it was. 10 years, it was worth it. Every bit of it. He was over the moon about that. He said, that's a big one, that one, isn't it? Yeah.
That was the headlines of the day. And you grew up knowing about it because people like Dad and Uncle Bully used to religiously read it and talk about it. And at that stage we was just kids, and we'd wander in and our grandfather was talking in a funny language, and it'd be a chuckle and run out the door sort of thing. And we understood what was going on, but being kids we were playful and did other things.
Richard's grandfather, Dick Houlihan, was working with a university linguist, recording his Gugubadan language.
We're doing a language revival type program, and we're able to access our traditional language.
He always said, that we cannot let the culture die. He said we must fight for that right to the end, and that's why he said the importance of land. And he said yes, and the culture must be always with us.
Dick Houlihan attended communist meetings into his late 70s. ASIO, tracking him over 25 years, recorded one of his last speeches.
Shortly after Houlihan commenced to speak, he began to shake so badly that William Francis Bishop continued his speech, explaining that Houlihan was a very sick man and was suffering from Parkinson's disease.
Dr. Douglas told me that he wouldn't last very long, he'd probably end up in a wheelchair, but I think he was in his late 70s when he died, and he was still shaving himself right up until the last day he died.
And that sort of slowed him down, but it never stopped him from being involved. He still got along to the meetings and that sort of thing, He never sort of sat down and let it beat him. He was an amazing man, He was strong, he was a fighter. He was a fighter to the end,
Our family's very upfront about being a part of the change. Uncle Bully in Townsville was a part of setting up the Aboriginal Islander Health Service. I think he wrote the submission for it. He also set up the Aboriginal Islander Legal Service. He set up the Aboriginal Islander Housing Organisation. But running parallel to that, my father was a part of setting up the same organisations in Mount Isa, and they obviously shared ideas and shared ways that they were doing things.
Those are the things I've sort of fought for, like housing mainly, because I believe if they get a place to live in, a lot of other problems fall into place.
By the 70s, many of the Illin descendants were living in Townsville, close enough for the children to move between aunts, uncles and cousins, sometimes for a night, sometimes more permanently.
I was one of those wayward kids. You know, I wasn't doing too well at home, and of course I wasn't listening to Mum and Dad, and so I got sent to stay with Auntie Lily for a while. And of course the boys was a big problem, as usual, with every young girl's life. You know, Dad wasn't violent, so for what reason, God knows why, I ended up in a relationship where there was violence and stayed there for a good 13 years. Eventually, I got out of the relationship and, I more or less brought the 5 kids up on my own. And I think that's what Dad, being the person that he was, you know, brought us up to be strong and you know, you don't treat people that way. It's just not the way you treat people, you know, you people are equal. We thought, well, bugger this, you know, I'm not going to be, I've got to go and get educated and get a job if that's going to happen. So I did. I went back to TAFE, and in 1994 I started my Bachelor of Education at University of Technology, Sydney, and I graduated in May 98. Well, I'm with someone now who is non-Indigenous, and I'm quite happy. I mean, gee whiz. And when I stop and think of my granddad being non-Indigenous and my grandmum being Indigenous, you know, you think, gee, they must have loved one another. He must have loved her to be with her, you know, and have 5 children. So I often think of Granddad and I thought, how did he cope, you know, after he'd lost Grandma? How did he, the daily things like bringing up, and daughters when they go through womanhood and stuff like that. And
I don't think he worried about ever getting married again. What woman would want to be his wife with 5 young children? So he never ever worried. And we'd be way out in the bush, no neighbours close to us, nobody to take care of us if anything had happened. Yet, nothing happened to us. We never ever got hurt, we never ever got sick. Was my mother there guiding us, looking after us until we grew up? Who knows?
In 1998, a parcel of Kitty Clarke's traditional land was returned to her people, the Nudgin Mitcha. The Queensland government signed over a 99-year lease to the site of the original mission.
Well, when it got handed over, I just cried because I think, I think about Dad and Auntie Lily and Uncle Harry, you know. I think about them all because I wish that they were there. When I go up there to the Atherton, I just feel that peace, calm, and it just feels so lovely.
You
can just go back and it's good. It's a good feeling to know that you're still there and that was their land.
Yeah, very important to me because that gives me a sense of where I fit into the grand scheme of things and gives me a sense of belonging.
Yeah, we have a very close connection to country. We visit as often as we can. We share a lot of cultural stuff with our kids. We've got elders there, we've got people who are my age there who are sharing things with them that they'd never learn in a school. Teach the kids language and that sort of stuff. They love it.
There is no harm in keeping your mind set on freedom.
By the end of the 20th century, Aboriginal culture was being celebrated across the nation. 500,000 Australians marched for reconciliation at Corroboree 2000. The same year, Russian writer Eleanor Kavor published My Dark Brother, the story of the Illin dynasty. By 2002, the Queensland Premier Peter Beattie acknowledged the old people's stories of their stolen wages. Beattie promised his government would give a written apology to all those who endured the Aboriginal Protection Act and acknowledge past injustices on the basis of race. It was all conditional on claimants accepting the non-negotiable offer of $4,000 and signing away all rights to any other legal action.
If people slam the door in the face of the government, then that is their decision. This is a democracy. People have the right to choose. But if they choose to go down the legal course, it'll waste millions of dollars and many people will never see this money. They will die before the matter is resolved in the courts.
3 years after this statement, the case was still unresolved.
I often think if I had went to school and had some good education, maybe I'd have been living in jail, because I'd be fighting hard for people that was downtrodden. Might have been a different life for me if I had the education. But I do think when they see people that need help, should be helped. The downtrodden people.
Auntie Flora, she's getting old now, and you can tell that time is coming near for it. Well, she's been telling us for the last 20 years that I won't be here much longer. And we always tell her, yeah, well, you'll probably be still here after we're gone, the way she goes on. I'm dreading the day that Auntie Flora goes, because I'm thinking, oh, well, that's the end of an era. Oh, I love Auntie Flora. She's like her mum. She's a kind person and she's a loving person.
I've done nothing. Only rear my children. Work for them. I did work for them. Do everything I could for them. That's all. I was a housewife. I'm very happy and proud that they are making a picture based upon my father for what he done for people and his fairness and honesty. I'm very proud of that. My children are, and my grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and all my nieces and nephews feel the same. I feel very happy about it.